Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the LIPS presentation. Our speaker today is Hannah Teicher, Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at Harvard University, Graduate School of Design. My name is Mauricio Rada, and I'm a PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning program. And I will be moderating the session along with my co-organizers, Diana Guo and Vinita Codinardo. I will begin with a few brief logistical announcements before turning to introduce our speaker. We are recording today's lecture, so please remember this if you don't wish to be recorded. After the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. We will start Q&A around 2 to 2:50 p.m. so that we have enough time for everyone's questions. I will be coordinating Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion, so if you have already had a chance to ask a question, please allow others to do so before asking another one. To ask questions, please raise your hand and we will call you. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Hannah Teicher is an assistant professor of urban planning at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Her research is broadly concerned with how adaptation to climate change is shaping urban transformations across scales. She co-chairs the Welcoming Communities Work Group for the Climate Migration Network. In her work on collaborations, she's conducting research with an interdisciplinary multi-university team to understand how adaptation solutions can be co-produced in regions with extensive urban military interdependence. She has published her research in journals including Climate Policy, the Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning, Urban Climate, and the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. She holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT, a Master's of Architecture from UBC, and a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Swarthmore College. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hannah Teicher.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, and it's really nice to be here. I actually did my freshman year at Columbia a long time ago, so it's always interesting to be back. So today I want to talk to you about the notion of the climate refuge, one which you may have noticed has been pretty controversial lately. First, I'm going to discuss how the concept evolved, and then I'll cover how I've sought to bring a more expansive perspective to research in that area. And finally, I'm going to delve into a case study to highlight how the climate refuge is actually evolving on the ground. So the concept of the climate haven has undergone a rapid transformation in just a few short years. A question that has come up again and again is whether the refuge is elusive or pure illusion. As recently as 2017 and 2018, it could plausibly be considered as entertaining speculation, the subject of listicles in the genre of best vacation spots. In other words, it served as a diversion or pure escapism. The concept quickly became more serious and complicated as devastating floods and fires became an ever-present part of our new climate reality. Relocation during COVID also provided a glimpse of how post-disaster relocation might play out. As mobile urbanites moved to ostensibly safer places during COVID, it became clear, unsurprisingly, that COVID havens and climate havens were prone to elite capture. Newcomers often got pushback from long-term residents. Newcomers drove up housing costs, resulting in displacement. The drastically different priorities are summed up neatly in this article. New Kingston is loudly advocating for bike lanes, and Old Kingston just wants its sewers fixed. In spite of these potential conflicts, cities also saw an economic development opportunity in attracting newcomers. Some, notably Buffalo and Duluth, pitched themselves as climate havens. The conflicts between newcomers and long-term residents are serious, but beyond this, the complications of the climate haven concept abound. Even for locations that seem relatively resilient, they are still highly interconnected with places that are exposed. As COVID aptly demonstrated, there is no escaping supply chain disruptions. In locations that have lost population and ostensibly have space, infrastructure from housing to transportation is often in poor condition, even by conventional definitions, and is far from climate resilient. The notion of the climate haven as a place to escape to can also breed complacency. If escape is possible, there may be less need for climate action. And perhaps most troubling, there is mounting evidence of disaster in purported climate havens. The recent experience in Asheville demonstrates this in spades. I was actually really surprised to see just how many articles were coming out after Hurricane Helene led to, devastating flooding in Asheville. So all of a sudden, this climate haven idea became much more controversial. The shock of the floods in Asheville harkens back to the shock of the floods in Montpelier, Vermont, in the summer of 2023. Vermont had also gained attention and population as a COVID and climate haven. This sense that disasters could hit anywhere, that no place was safe from climate impacts, has left many to argue that there is no such thing as a climate haven, that there is nothing to rely on beyond mutual aid and neighbor helping neighbor. Others are now asking where the dangerous myth of the climate haven came from. That's a topic on its own and something that we can get into in the discussion. But today, I'd like to suggest that this attempt to close down the climate haven concept is actually problematic because climate-related relocation is already happening and growing. Projections of future climate migration vary wildly, but we do know that even just looking at the domestic context, several million people are already displaced annually. Globally, 30 million were displaced in 2020. Estimates of future domestic climate migration start at 13 million in response to sea level rise alone. Estimates of global climate displacement, which is already contributing to immigration to the US, range from 216 million to over 1 billion by 2050. These numbers are often cited to stoke fear around climate migrants as a security threat. But my point is that people are moving right now for climate-related reasons. And this means that they are not just leaving cities and towns, but they are moving to cities and towns. This process of people arriving in havens, destinations, refuges, or receiving communities will unfold one way or another. Like retreat before it, the question is whether it will be planned or unplanned, whether communities will plan to effectively receive, accommodate, and integrate newcomers in a way that is also adaptive to accelerating climate change. Beyond the transitions this portends within cities and communities, this will become an increasingly influential vector of change between cities and across the urban landscape, potentially shifting the center of gravity inland, away from the coasts. Climate havens per se don't exist. There is no place that is naturally safe and resilient in some environmentally determined way, but climate-related relocation will inexorably grow, meaning that there will be receiving communities, and we need to plan for them. As planning scholars and practitioners, people with the capacity to imagine and plan for longer range urban futures, this is a condition that requires our attention. As the discourse of the climate haven has rapidly evolved over the last 5 years, it has received a remarkable amount of media attention. It has only been officially adopted in city plans and policies in a few cases so far, but it will foreseeably join the ranks of the smart city, the creative city, or the green city in shaping urban aspirations and competition. With the climate refuge city deployed for better or worse in the service of both imagining and implementing urban futures, we as planning practitioners and scholars should be critical of what it enables or precludes. But it is also crucial at this point to interrogate how it might be deployed to productive ends. We need to move beyond debates over an ostensibly fickle, short-lived notion of the climate haven to instead understand how the climate refuge could operate as a long-term project. The productive version of the climate refuge is not making headlines because it doesn't drive clicks, but it has been slowly emerging in policy and practice circles for several years now, where there is a growing recognition of the potential to cross-pollinate between traditional immigrant welcoming practices and climate migration. Welcoming America, one of the main NGOs institutionalizing immigrant welcoming over the last 15 years, has recently recognized welcoming as resilience. In a white paper, they are advocating for social infrastructure in tandem with physical infrastructure to prepare communities to welcome people displaced by climate disasters. They offer a welcoming standard and have certified welcoming cities, counties, and rural areas across the country. So their recognition of this shared agenda could be very influential. They highlight the beginning of an ecosystem around climate change and migration. A few other examples from this ecosystem show that bridges are building between integration and adaptation work. In a report prepared by the National League of Cities and Buy-in Community Planning on planning for climate migration, they explicitly recommend that climate destinations or legacy cities positioning themselves for growth through climate migration acquire certification through Welcoming America's program. The National Partnership for New Americans has developed a climate justice collaborative to organize at the intersection of climate and migration. One of their strategies is supporting a climate displaced leaders cohort, which supports the choice to stay or leave a climate impacted community. They advocate for the US to be a leader in welcoming migrants displaced by climate change. They're also working to change the narrative around migration so that climate change is seen as the threat rather than migrants. On the global stage, the climate network juggernaut C40 formed a joint task force with the Mayors Migration Council in 2021 to develop a global mayor's action agenda on climate and migration. They advocate for cities to pursue inclusive action on climate and migration according to principles such as partnering with migrant and displaced communities and providing access to services regardless of legal status. This task force has been involved in the last several COPs, advocating for city-led solutions to climate and migration, while also pointing to the important supporting role of higher levels of government. They argue that migration should be recognized as a form of adaptation, and that this should be incorporated into national climate action strategies. The emerging productive version of the climate refuge is what I'm calling inclusionary adaptation. It has yet to fully coalesce, and its future remains uncertain. It will certainly not replace the other versions. The fanciful escapism of the early days has largely been put to rest, as constant hurricanes, floods, and fires make climate impacts all too present. But the dark prospects of either being reduced to mutual aid or capitulating to elite capture will persist. As these versions compete with each other, the only question is which will embody a greater share of the future as climate-related relocation inevitably grows. This growing trend of building bridges between immigrant welcoming and adaptation in policy circles had not yet filtered into research on climate-receiving communities. Crucially, this approach recognized that climate is not exceptional and that climate-related issues have much to learn from adjacent areas of practice. I saw an opportunity to expand and deepen the planning perspective on receiving communities by adopting this approach of learning from research on analogies and overlapping conditions. I considered historical analogies, but there's already a body of work illuminating what we can learn from the history of environmental migration, from the Dust Bowl to the Great Migration. So I chose to focus on contemporary analogies to offer the most immediate relevance. I determined that research on amenity migration or migration to rural and outdoor lifestyle destinations also offered significant parallels. I asked what we could learn for climate receiving communities from existing research on immigrant integration and amenity migration. Looking to this research, I asked what it could tell us about how receiving communities can and should prepare for newcomers, adding depth and perspective to the emerging work on climate refuge cities. So now I want to discuss how we can think about this by learning from other research, and then I will delve into a recent case study in which I build on this framing while exploring how a climate refuge is beginning to take shape on the ground. So first, we can learn several significant points from immigrant integration. Many of the immigrant destinations have been declining Rust Belt cities that see welcoming as a potential economic development strategy. This has had mixed results. In some cases, it has helped to attract high-skilled immigrants, but the results are more questionable for lower-skilled immigrants. In other cases, factors such as affordable housing have been more important than place branding. In some of these shrinking cities, immigrants have compensated for population loss. But clearly, this new population is not a one-to-one replacement. Often new immigrants are younger and more employable than the population leaving the city. Welcoming as economic development produces the risk of conditional welcoming, meaning that the existing population only approves of the newcomers to the extent that they do provide an economic boost, rather than on their own terms. Finally, many welcoming efforts tend to focus on social services, but flexible land use and spatial planning can be important as well. For example, residential development that accommodates multi-generational households and informal uses of public space. However, these differences can also cause tensions between newcomers and existing communities. From amenity migration, we can also learn a few important points. First, the types of amenity migrants have been expanding. The classic ones were snowbirds, retirees flocking to warmer climates. But recent amenity migration has been driven by remote workers and outdoor enthusiasts. There is some evidence that these people are concentrating in areas with cooler summers. Next, in migration research, we tend to hear about push and pull factors. That is, factors that push people away from places such as hazards and that pull people towards other places such as job opportunities. But there are also larger economic forces at work. Individuals and families may be making a choice to move to outdoor destinations, but agricultural restructuring is also making residential development more lucrative than typical rural economic activities. So this rural gentrification is also having an impact. As some of these rural destinations, such as Jackson, Wyoming, Moab, Utah, or Aspen, Colorado, have become more popular, they are starting to develop so-called big city problems, such as worsening inequality, congestion, and sprawl. There are an array of land use tools that can be used to address these issues. Some are similar to those used in urban areas, such as affordable housing requirements for new developments, while others are more tailored to small towns, such as zoning for ecological buffers and land easements. Often a mix of approaches would be used, but in any case, good land use policy could become an amenity in its own right, creating its own set of challenges. There's also been some recent emerging research on receiving communities, so it was important to learn from that too. Just as it is everywhere now, affordable housing is a prime concern. To address the need for housing in cities with flood risk, those cities may zone for internal receiving areas, as Norfolk, Virginia has, making long-range plans for upzoning higher ground for multifamily affordable housing. At the regional scale, regions may consider the transfer of development rights between sending and receiving areas, as King County has. and municipalities may seek opportunities to annex adjacent higher ground, as Princeville, North Carolina has. At a larger scale, the federal government could offer tax deductions for renters in receiving zones to support affordable housing. A simplistic assessment of legacy communities sees a lot of available space, making them seem like prime locations for relocation. But they often have long histories of entrenched segregation and inequality. In response, in some early efforts in Buffalo, neighborhood groups have worked with the city to undertake asset and vulnerability assessments as part of anti-displacement efforts that's helped when there's been an influx of newcomers. Also in Buffalo, community-oriented economic development, such as an incubator for food businesses, has supported immigrant entrepreneurship and interaction between long-term residents and newcomers. Many working in this space argue that cities cannot act alone, that coordination between cities and with higher levels of government are necessary. Well-established transnational city networks, smaller city networks, and regional climate collaboratives could play a leading role in this. Some community-based organizations are already developing connections between sending and receiving areas, indicating some appetite for this type of bridging. So synthesizing this research on immigrant integration, amenity migration, and receiving communities, I developed several insights for planning for receiving communities. First, it is important to reconcile economic development and social inclusion. As I mentioned, there is always a risk of conditional welcoming on the basis of treating newcomers as an economic salve. To avoid this, cities and neighborhoods can develop initiatives for two-way mutual integration with existing residents built on a reciprocal process. Planners can identify the mutual needs of new arrivals and existing communities. At the same time, it is important to address the distinct needs of newcomers and enhanced needs of current residents. First, with newcomers moving in, there is a high risk of displacement. This needs to be recognized and planned for early on. At the same time, incoming populations will usually have different demographics, so social, educational, and employment services will need to be developed to meet the distinct needs of these newcomers. Finally, in legacy cities, adaptation can be more feasible when it's a co-benefit to reducing racial and economic inequality. And then zooming out to the bigger picture of how this transition could affect urban geographies, planners should be aware of planning for deconcentration and a shifting urban hierarchy. As climate-related relocation grows, it will likely result in the spreading out of population to suburbs, exurbs, and small communities. Migration theories as they stand now have largely developed in an urban context. So with more migration to exurban and rural destinations, it will be important to examine the differences that produces. And over the long term, we may see the prominence of coastal cities recede as their economic base is compromised. Inland cities may become more economically, socially, and culturally important. At the same time, the kinds of population shifts we're already seeing suggest a kind of long-distance climate gentrification, where resilient places become increasingly unaffordable. This is the elite capture I referred to earlier. There is a long-standing and increasingly relevant debate over whether migration serves as adaptation. This review helped to drive home the point that it is not migration itself, but integration in the destination that serves as adaptation. Otherwise, migration can too easily be a cover for governance failures. So now I'd like to move on to a case study of Worcester, Massachusetts. So I approached this case study wanting to understand, in the first generation of climate refuge cities, why and how do cities accommodate climate-related migration? In a city that explicitly positions itself as a climate refuge, what are the motivating factors? Do municipal and community efforts deliver the capacity to implement this agenda? And if so, what are the outcomes, enablers of, and barriers to integrating climate-related newcomers? As I mentioned earlier, in spite of the extensive media attention to climate havens, very few cities have so far inserted the notion of the climate refuge into official planning or policy. In the Great Lakes and Northeast region, which has been broadly conceived of as a receiving zone, only 4 cities over 150,000 have officially referred to themselves in this way. Duluth is smaller, but I included it here because it has received so much hype. In contrast, Worcester, Massachusetts is one of them, but has received little attention for this fact. This made it a productive case study to examine the substance of a climate refuge city in a more realistic way that was not obscured by media hype. I wanted to understand the motivations behind the designation, the level of capacity to deliver on it or not, and the challenges it faced. Worcester meets the criteria of a climate refuge or climate destination, as I and others, such as Mirandia, Maine, have begun to define it. First, the city included the potential to serve as a climate refuge in its 2020 Sustainability and Resilience Plan. Second, it is a legacy city with a history of post-industrial decline, making it likely to position itself as a climate refuge city to attract growth. Finally, it has some history of immigration. As a minor continuous gateway, it had a substantial influx in the first half of the 20th century and a resurgence since the 1990s. However, Worcester is also a somewhat exceptional case because it has experienced a major population rebound. As of 2020, it had exceeded its peak 20th century population, which is unusual for a legacy city. Many have had some recent growth, but remain far below their peak populations. As a result, Worcester is a harbinger of the challenges climate destinations are likely to face. And because it's nearby, it offered a way of studying the climate refuge without exoticizing it. I conducted this case study through semi-structured interviews with stakeholders in local government, nonprofits, think tanks, media, and community-based organizations, and then triangulated those results with policies and plans. So first, I wanted to analyze the discourse, and I examined the local evolution of the climate refuge discourse, analyzing whether it merely supported economic opportunism and elite capture. Elite capture can be understood from a few angles, both in terms of high-income households moving to more affordable places and city growth coalitions catering to that demographic in economic development strategies. One of the more common motivations for a city to position itself as a climate haven, as I've already mentioned, is that it sees an economic development opportunity. That is not necessarily a problem in its own right, but it does create the risk of conditional welcoming. In Worcester, during the development of the sustainability plan, the framing that the consultant initially brought to the table did seem to hinge on economic development. But further research revealed a more nuanced evolution of the discourse. First, Worcester had become a de facto climate refuge for Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria. And some in the nonprofit community saw this as an obvious experience to build on. As one director of an NGO said, it only makes sense that as the climate gets weird, we are likely to also receive people, if only because we have experience with it and infrastructure that is supporting incoming populations. Others also recognize the multiple ways in which migration would be expedient. They saw that it would be both voluntary and involuntary, and that migrants often seek familiar terrain and communities. So as a member of the city staff said, some folks are just going to, by necessity and by choice, are going to start moving west. Some may move much further west, but many want to keep a lot of the things that they're comfortable with in Massachusetts. It fits that this would be the next best choice. It was interesting to see that serving as a de facto refuge could lay the groundwork for an explicit destination, and that some of the major dynamics identified in migration studies were being recognized on the ground. But what was really interesting was that the approach on paper in this green plan framed the climate refuge not as escape, but as a premise for adaptation. And this is in the context of a plan that emphasizes equity for vulnerable communities. So as the plan says, by preparing for climate change, Worcester has the opportunity to become the climate refuge city of choice in Massachusetts, as people on the coast may prefer to move to more inland locations. This contradicts the narrative that the refuge merely offers an escape hatch for the wealthy or undermines climate action. Instead, it is an active premise for adaptation. This offers a vision for a substantive climate refuge that accommodates newcomers and builds adaptation in place. Earlier, I made the point that migration only serves as adaptation in the limited cases when it results in integration. This model of inclusionary adaptation goes further. It operates at the nexus of adaptation and the integration of newcomers, and works around principles that build synergies between them. I propose this framework to put into practice the insights I derived in learning from immigrant integration and amenity migration. And this operates through three interlinked elements. One, reducing uneven risks, considering where newcomers resettle in relation to local frontline communities experiencing climate risk to contribute to equitable outcomes for both. Two, planning for population change, accounting for the impacts of both population growth and demographic shifts in existing plans and programs for social and physical resilience. And three, fostering social ties, supporting social ties between newcomers and current residents to help build social resilience. The potential for the climate refuge to serve as a premise for adaptation is still largely aspirational, but some existing community-led initiatives in Worcester illustrate how the adaptation and integration of newcomers can be synergistic, not just a matter of borrowing practices, but producing hybrid forms of practice. The examples I found in Worcester touch on several major domains of planning: community engagement, housing, and food security. So first, Worcester had a very strong community coalition. Worcester had a large Puerto Rican community before Hurricane Maria hit the island, so the city became a destination. Community organizations rapidly coalesced to support the influx after the hurricane, and this built capacity that laid the groundwork for the COVID response. So as a director of an NGO said, we did this for Hurricane Maria, and we have the capacity to mobilize again. Through the pandemic, a range of local organizations supported collaboration. The local foundation changed their grant-making approach to serve small organizations. Other NGOs advocated to funders to require collaboration as a condition of grant-making. This built a new model of local community resilience during the pandemic. This coalition of organizations became Worcester Together, representing a culture of collective action. During and since the pandemic, other crises have continued to emerge, from food insecurity to unhoused seniors. So Worcester Together has stayed together to serve as a cornerstone of community response. In this example, coming together to address emerging challenges has fostered a strong sense of social cohesion, while supporting immediate resettlement needs for newcomers created the capacity to address other crises and future resettlement. In another example, a housing retrofit pilot program served as a model for addressing intersecting vulnerabilities that affect adaptation capacity. Spearheaded by the local chapter of the NAACP, this partnership included a range of local environmental justice organizations working together to upgrade triple-deckers in a low-income neighborhood. This type of wood-framed housing with 3 stacked apartments was built around the turn of the 20th century as immigrant and working-class housing, and has been a staple of affordable housing ever since. Given the age of these buildings and inadequate maintenance, many of them have fire hazards from old knob and tube wiring to gas leaks, and health hazards such as mold and asbestos. Addressing these basic issues which seriously impact health and integrating these fixes with energy efficiency, electrification, and resilience upgrades offers a model for a holistic approach to sustainability. The city looked to this program for guidance on how to approach upgrades of the almost 5,000 triple deckers in Worcester. So as a member of the city staff said, if you can harden that triple decker, drive their costs down for fuel, for electricity, drive their healthcare costs down, because now they're not going to the ER and paying a $500 ER bill once or twice a month. You're making it a lot more sustainable overall. While the triple deckers are being physically adapted for climate change, multi-generational housing supports integration by reducing vulnerabilities for low-income and immigrant families, accommodating population growth and change. A final example in the domain of food security offers multiple promising features. A regional food network with a mobile farmers market has been serving local low-income communities and newcomers in a complementary, mutually beneficial way. The vast majority of the market's customers use SNAP benefits, which are supplemented by a state healthy incentives program. This program has garnered bipartisan support because it benefits local farmers as well as communities experiencing food insecurity. Like all mobile markets, they meet people where they are geographically by going to over 16 locations around the city each week. But they also meet people where they are culturally, regularly adjusting and responding to feedback about the most culturally relevant food for each community. The Food Network has multiple additional benefits. Selling food from local farmers, some of whom are new Americans themselves, helps to build local food security and reduce dependence on distant supply chains. The mobility itself offers the flexibility to respond to emerging needs and crises. For example, during COVID, the markets delivered food directly to people. They also provide a place for experimenting with crops. So as one of the directors of the program said, our farm manager also does cultural crop production, also looking at adapting different crops to the New England growing climate, especially for Latino folks. He's bringing seeds over from Puerto Rico and testing what can we grow on the farm, what adaptations are possible. So for now, this is focused on maintaining cultural foodways, but could also be valuable for future crop adaptation as climate conditions alter historic growing zones. When they are out in the community, the mobile markets help to build social ties. At the same time, their fundamental mission of supporting food security reduces uneven risk. While these examples are promising in showing the potential for synergies between adaptation and integration, of course, the climate refuge city in the case of Worcester also faces serious challenges. The first is centered on the persistent dominance of an unreconstructed growth coalition as the city navigates the transition from shrinking to growing. Responding to a debate over inclusionary zoning, a staff member at an NGO articulated the pitfalls of this transition. So Worcester spent a long time with an identity challenge, just around how can we convince people to come and want to build and develop here? I don't think our policies have caught up with the fact that that has changed, and now we are seen as a desirable city. In addition to failing to pass stringent inclusionary zoning, Worcester ignored flood zones in new development, another example of pursuing growth as usual. Green Island was one of the lowest lying neighborhoods in the city, as its name suggests. Largely built on a wetland, it was prone to flooding and heavy rain. Without remediating this, the city rebranded Green Island to the Canal District, encouraging several anchors of new development, including a ballpark and a food hall. The transition from decline to rapid growth is likely to be an accentuated feature of the climate refuge city, as slower growing inland and legacy cities will become destinations. And it is typically difficult for a growth coalition to shift its orientation in that transition from shrinking to growing. Where shrinking cities have been constrained to pursuing growth at all costs, once they have tipped into growth, they are in a position to pursue various forms of accountable development, from community benefits agreements to inclusionary zoning. The evolution of growth machine theory has offered us the green growth machine and the resilience machine, in which sustainability interventions simply offer a pretext for exacting more value from real estate. The High Line here in New York is, of course, one of the paradigmatic examples of green gone wrong. But when we step outside of the context of global cities, this case study of Worcester confirms previous research that in ordinary cities, conventional development poses a greater risk to inclusion and sustainability. That is, growth coalitions simply obstruct resilience rather than co-opting it. While governing for inclusion is more difficult than governing for growth, we can look to traditional gateway cities like Vancouver, BC, and Sydney, Australia, that have been long-time landing spots for people and capital to see how they're seeking to rein in the worst excesses of unfettered growth. At this inflection point, climate refuge cities have an opportunity to learn as they are in the process of becoming the next gateways. Another major challenge to the climate refuge city is the limitations of community-led resilience. As a local journalist said, that's the interesting thing about Worcester that makes it a really good climate refuge city in some cases, but maybe not in all cases. It's like if we have a strong ethnic community of a certain people that are being displaced somewhere, then it's going to go really well. If it's just the routine displacement of people, then it's not going to go very well. And by extension, if it's a different ethnic community, that may also not go so well. This fact that welcoming is often contingent on shared ethnicity or national origin means that we can expect welcoming to be inconsistent. This is another form of conditional welcoming, just as in other immigrant reception contexts, where newcomers are only well received if they are perceived to contribute to economic development. Beyond this, even given the strength of the local community response, resources have been stretched to the breaking point. In one example, a local settlement agency struggled with the prospect of people sleeping on their lawn because there wasn't enough temporary housing available, and they emphasized the need for a larger, more coordinated response. In dominant resilience discourse, community resilience is often romanticized, and responsibility is deployed against vulnerable individuals and communities. Multiple levels of government often download responsibility to the communities that are both most impacted and have the least capacity. Climate migration itself can be an example of this, and relying on refugee resilience creates a double burden. Finally, valorizing community-based initiatives can legitimize further government retreat when those resources and capacity are needed to fulfill mandates, such as in this case, Massachusetts' right to shelter law. So where does this leave us? Whether we will see a robust form of inclusionary adaptation remains an open question. But it is important to hold on to the notion that mutual aid and elite capture are not the only potential futures for the climate haven. Instead, the climate refuge city can serve as a premise for adaptation. And this is key to planning for it as a long-term project rather than an escapist distraction. For the climate refuge to be adaptive for both current residents and newcomers, cities will have to proactively manage the transition to avoid replicating the conditions of contemporary gateway cities. As climate-related relocation grows, we are at an inflection point where we can play a role in understanding and planning for this transforming urban landscape. So now I'm interested in your questions and comments. Yeah, there was a large Puerto Rican community in Worcester. It's about 200,000 people.
The population decline was just really dramatic for 10 years.
Yeah, I think it was more than 10 years, but,
Just seemed like the recovery was extremely bad.
yeah. There was a large influx of refugees and immigrants from around the world. So there's actually a very large Ghanaian and Vietnamese population, and there are some Central American communities there. I'm actually not sure of the exact reason, and I do need to figure out more about this, but Worcester became the major destination for immigrants in Massachusetts, and I believe it was largely because Worcester was much more affordable at the time. So there's been this large migration, and even there have been economic migrants from the Boston region because Worcester is now affordable, but is kind of within reach. You know, there's train service, it's an hour away. Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's not like this kind of model is just putting some everything. I mean, clearly with the general failings of many levels of government, it's going to be absolutely necessary and really question how much people have to rely on that. But I guess I want to suggest that there is an alternative, and that I think it's pretty bleak to say it's the only thing now. Yeah. No, they actually are the same size. They were sitting above 150,000 from a couple of them. But it was more than the less developed cities. I think it was even something
Smaller cities too, that, like here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Because I was looking for some cities that were more comfortable with certain things to think about, but yeah, I mean, I know this is all changing so rapidly that, that map might even be a little bit out of date by now. Yeah.
I wonder with those cities in particular, do they have population from, like they have higher education facilities, they have like growth industries, like more advanced education and
Yeah.
medical services. So they have employers, but they also maybe have coalitions around social justice, where like I feel like in some places people started to talk about the refugees rather than just refugees. Like how you're all blue states, for instance.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I think that some of the work that Welcoming America and the National Partnership for New Americans are trying to do in changing the narrative, starting to work with, you know, not just big cities and not just cities in blue states, but cities around the country and even rural areas, try to build support for welcoming immigrants.
About whether city and the public units where migrants. You've heard them here, but they're
Well, I don't think, I think I very rarely guess they're American. Live in
That's
Laos.
what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
There's an interesting, social level question of how I'm assuming this is.
No. Or go ahead.
I guess I'm waiting for the background.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that it came. I looked at it, it's about credits, a lot of credits. I was curious why I think this was it. It has American, sort of in
Yeah.
this.
So there was already a long-standing Puerto Rican community. And they were the ones that really mobilized to bring in the new Puerto Ricans, so that definitely made a difference. But there has been some backlash, and this is all controversial. So for example, someone I interviewed mentioned that, oh, of course, Worcester is a sanctuary city, but I looked into it and it actually was not, and the city council had explicitly voted against making Worcester a sanctuary city. So it is really complicated. I think, when I approach the research, I feel like it's always easy to critique. And, if you go into a place like this and kind of just critique it, I'm always kind of looking for what are some of the more productive examples and how can we build on them while also recognizing that it is very challenging, which is why I kind of end with the challenges. So I think the more positive examples are just kind of small threads that could be built on. It's not the class. It's very not kind of just like all in place. Yeah, I think that's a big question where a lot of people in the streets have to be for that. And I think that a lot of additional complications and we're guessing having some kind of one-to-one relationship. And it's probably much more realistic that there would be peer learning network between sending and the speaking areas. So also the sending areas have a lot of but there's a lot of resistance to the frequency. So we really population on these. No, I don't have the.
I'm very happy for this concept of inclusion and populating cities with federal policy that's very tied to the grid, in ways divided there's administration of the border. So I think and also the international policies often reducing climate refuge. So I'm just wondering, like, that sort of dichotomy between localities being inclusive, or even New York State, you have constitutional right shelter, and now we're back there that are investing for certain people, certainly for immigrants. So I'm wondering how we reconcile will that's
very tricky and really hard to do. But so I guess I want to make the point that in one way I'm learning from immigrant integration analogy. So it's not necessarily just about international immigrants, it's about how do you integrate each other in a place. And I think that's also the piece that well in America is trying to understand how to translate from this world to practice. You need to normally place Americans in kind of like the most, but certainly setting down work. Just like the Like how we. Yeah, we have to consider the part of involvement in policy that also say that it's important to have a legal status, but. So. So this is just, many ways.
Today, and that is also for everybody for attention. So make sure to join us next Tuesday at the better. Surely, and start learn audience India, South Africa, exploration, variation, and organization. Thank you all.